Section 7 of A Book of Myths. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. A Book of Myths by Jean Lang. Section 7, Psyche. Those who read for the first time the story of Psyche must at once be struck by its kinship to the fairy tales of childhood. Here we have the three sisters, the two elder jealous and spiteful, the youngest beautiful and gentle, and quite unable to defend herself against her sister's wicked arts. Here, too, is the mysterious bridegroom, who is never seen, and who is lost to his bride because of her lack of faith. Truly, it is an old, old tale, older than all fairy tales, the story of love that is not strong enough to believe and to wait, and so to win through in the end, the story seeds of suspicion sown by one full of malice and an innocent heart, and which bring to the hapless reaper a cruel harvest. Once upon a time, so goes the tale, a king and queen had three beautiful daughters. The first and the second were fair indeed, but the beauty of the youngest was such that all the people of the land worshipped it as a thing sent straight from Olympus. They awaited her outside the royal palace, and when she came, they threw chaplets of roses and violets for her little feet to tread upon, and sang hymns of praise as though she were no mortal maiden, but a daughter of the deathless gods. There were many who said that the beauty of Aphrodite herself was less perfect than the beauty of Psyche, and when the goddess found that men were forsaking her altars in order to worship a mortal maiden, great was her wrath against them and against the princess who, all unwittingly, had wrought her this shameful harm. In her garden, sitting amongst the flowers and idly watching his mother's fair white doves as they preened their snowy feathers in the sun, Aphrodite found her son Eros and angrily poured forth to him the story of her shame. "Thine must be the task of avenging thy mother's honour," she said. "Thou who hast the power of making the loves of men, stab with one of thine arrows the heart of this presumptuous maiden, and shame her before all other mortals by making her love a monster from which all others shrink and which all despise." With wicked glee Eros heard his mother's commands. His beautiful face, still the face of a mischievous boy, lit up with merriment. This was, in truth, a game after his own heart. In the garden of Aphrodite is a fountain of sweet, another of bitter water, and Eros filled two amber vases, one from each fountain, hung them from his quiver, and straight he rose from earth and down the wind, went glittering 'twixt the blue sky and the sea. In her chamber Psyche lay fast asleep, and swiftly, almost without a glance at her, Eros sprinkled some of the bitter drops upon her lips, and then with one of his sharpest arrows pricked her snowy breast. Like a child who half awakes in fear and looks up with puzzled, wondering eyes, Psyche, with a little moan, opened eyes that were bluer than the violets in spring, and gazed at Eros. He knew that he was invisible, and yet her gaze made him tremble. "They spoke truth," said the lad to himself. "Not even my mother is as fair as this princess." For a moment her eyelids quivered and then dropped. Her long dark lashes fell on her cheeks, that were pink as the hearts of the fragile shells that the waves toss up on western beaches. Her red mouth, curved like the bow of Eros, smiled happily, and Psyche slept again. With heart that beat as it had never beaten before, Eros gazed upon her perfect loveliness. With gentle, pitying finger he wiped away the red drop where his arrow had wounded her, and then stooped and touched her lips with his own so lightly that Psyche in her dreams thought that they had been brushed by a butterfly's wings. Yet in her sleep she moved, and Eros, starting back, pricked himself with one of his arrows, and with that prick For Eros there passed away all the careless ease of the heart of a boy, and he knew that he loved Psyche with the unquenchable love of a deathless god. Now, with bitter regret, all his desire was to undo the wrong he had done to the one that he loved. Speedily he sprinkled her with the sweet water that brings joy, and when Psyche rose from her couch, she was radiant with the beauty that comes from a new, undreamed of happiness. From place to place Love followed her that day, and ever fairer to his eyes she grew, so that at last, when from her bower he flew, and underneath his feet the moonlit sea went shepherding his waves disorderly, he swore that of all gods and men no one should hold her in his arms but he alone, that she should dwell with him in glorious wise, like to a goddess in some paradise. Yea, he would get from Father Jove this grace that she should never die, but her sweet face and wonderful fair body would endure till the foundations of the mountains sure were molten in the sea. So utterly did he forget his mother's cruelty. William Morris. Meantime it came to be known all over the land, and in other lands to which the fame of the fair Psyche had spread, that the mighty goddess Aphrodite had declared herself the enemy of the princess. Therefore none dared seek her in marriage, and although many a noble youth sighed away his heart for love of her, she remained in her father's palace like an exquisite rose, whose thorns make those who fain would have it for their own fear to pluck it from the parent stem. Her sisters married, and her father marvelled why so strange a thing should come about, and why the most beautiful by far of his 3 daughters should remain unwed. At length, laden with royal gifts, an embassy was sent by the king to the oracle of Apollo to inquire what might be the will of the dwellers on Olympus concerning his fairest daughter. In a horror of anxiety, the king and his queen and Psyche awaited the return of the ambassadors. And when they returned, before ever a word was spoken, they knew that the oracle had spoken Psyche's doom. "No mortal lover shall fair Psyche know," said the oracle. "For bridegroom she shall have a monster that neither man nor god can resist. On the mountain top he awaits her coming. Woe unutterable shall come to the king and to all the dwellers in his land if he dares to resist the unutterable dictum of the deathless gods. Of dead corpses shalt thou be the king, and stumbling through the dark land shalt thou go, howling for second death to end thy woe." William Morris. Only for a little while did the wretched king strive to resist the decrees of fate, and in her own chamber, where so short a time before the little princess had known the joy of something inexpressible, something most exquisite, intangible, unknown, she sat like a flower broken by the ruthless storm, sobbing pitifully, dry-eyed, with sobs that strained her soul for the shameful, hideous fate that the gods had dealt her. All night, until her worn-out body could no longer feel, her worn-out mind think, and kind sleep came to bring her oblivion, Psyche faced the horror for the sake of her father and of his people, that she knew she could not avoid. When morning came, her handmaids, white-faced and red-eyed, came to deck her in all the bridal magnificence that befitted the most beautiful daughter of a king, and when she was dressed right royally, and as became a bride, there started up the mountain a procession, at sight of which the gods themselves must have wept. With bowed heads the king and queen walked before the litter upon which lay their daughter in her marriage veil of saffron colour, with rose wreath on her golden hair. White, white were the faces of the maidens who bore the torches, and yet rose red were they by the side of Psyche. Minstrels played wedding hymns as they marched onwards, and it seemed as though the souls of unhappy shades sobbed through the reeds and moaned through the strings as they played. At length they reached the rocky place where they knew they must leave the victim bride, and her father dared not meet her eyes as he turned his head to go. Yet Psyche watched the procession wending its way downhill. No more tears had she to shed, and it seemed to her that what she saw was not a wedding throng, but an assembly of broken-hearted people who went back to their homes with heavy feet after burying one that they loved. She saw no sign of the monster who was to be her bridegroom, yet at every little sound her heart grew sick with horror, and when the night wind swept through the craggy peaks, and its moans were echoed in loneliness, she fell on her face in deadly fear and lay on the cold rock in a swoon. Yet, had Psyche known it, the wind was her friend, for Eros had used Zephyrus as his trusty messenger and sent him to the mountain top to find the bride of him whom neither man nor god could resist. Tenderly, very tenderly, he was told, must he lift her in his arms and bear her to the golden palace in that green and pleasant land where Eros had his home. So, with all the gentleness of a loving nurse to a tired little child, Zephyrus lifted Psyche and sped with her in his strong arms to the flowery meadows behind which towered the golden palace of Eros, like the sun behind a sky of green and amber and blue and rose. Deeply, in the weariness of her grief, Psyche slept, and when she awoke, it was to start up with the chill hands of the realization of terrible actualities on her heart. But when her eyes looked round to find the barren rocks, the utter forsakenness, the coming of an unnameable horror, before her she saw only fair groves with trees bedecked with fruit and blossom, fragrant meadows, flowers whose beauty made her eyes grow glad. And from the trees sang birds with song more sweet than any that Psyche had ever known, and with brilliant plumage which they preened caressingly when they had dipped their wings in crystal sparkling fountains. There, too, stood a noble palace, golden-fronted and with arcades of stainless marble that shone like snow in the sun. At first all seemed like part of a dream from which she dreaded to awake, but soon there came to her the joy of knowing that all the exquisite things that made appeal to her senses were indeed realities. Almost holding her breath, she walked forward to the open golden doors. "It is a trap," she thought. "By this means does the monster subtly mean to lure me into his golden cage." Yet even as she thought, there seemed to be hovering round her winged words, like little golden birds with souls, and in her ears they whispered, "Fear not, doubt not. Recall the half-formed dreams that so short a time ago brought to thy heart such unutterable joy. No evil shall come to thee, only the bliss of loving and of being loved." Thus did Psyche lose her fear and enter the golden doors, and inside the palace she found that all the beautiful things of which she had ever dreamed, all the perfect things for which she had ever longed, were there to greet her. From one to another she flitted, like a humming-bird that sucks honey from one and then from another gorgeous flower. And then, when she was tired with so much wearing out of her thankful mind, she found a banquet ready spread for her, with all the dainties that her dainty soul liked best. And as she ate, music so perfect rejoiced her ears that all her soul was soothed and joyous and at peace. When she had refreshed herself, a soft couch stood before her, ready for her there to repose. And when that strange day had come to an end, Psyche knew that, monster or not, she was beloved by one who had thought for her every thought, and who desired only her desire. Night came at last, and when all was dark and still, and Psyche, wide awake, was full of forebodings and fears lest her happy dreams might only be misleading fancies, and horror incarnate might come to crown her peaceful day, Eros softly entered the palace that was his own. Even as he had gone to the palace of her father, he went now, and found Psyche lying with violet eyes that stared into the velvety darkness, seeking something that she hoped for, trembling before something that brought her dread. His voice was as the voice of spring when it breathes on the sleeping earth. He knew each note in love's music, every word in the great thing that is love's vocabulary. Love loved, and Psyche listened, and soon she knew that her lover was Love himself. Thus for Psyche did a time of perfect happiness begin. All through the day she roamed in her love's dominion, and saw on every side the signs of his passion and of his tenderness. All through the night he stayed by her, and satisfied all the longing of her heart. Yet always ere daybreak Eros left her, and when she begged him to stay, he only made answer, "I am with thee only while I keep my visage hidden. And if thou once shouldst see my face, I must forsake thee. The high gods link love with faith, and he withdraws himself from the full gaze of knowledge." Lewis Morris. So did time glide past for Psyche, and ever she grew more in love with love. Always did her happiness become more complete. Yet ever and again there returned to her the remembrance of those sorrowful days when her father and mother had broken their hearts over her martyrdom, and her sisters had looked askance at her as at one whose punishment must assuredly have come from her own misdoing. Thus at length she asked Eros to grant her, for love's sake, a boon, to permit her to have her sisters come see for themselves the happiness that was hers. Most unwillingly was her request granted, for the heart of Eros told him that from their visit no good could come. Yet he was unable to deny anything to Psyche, and on the following day Zephyrus was sent to bring the two sisters to the pleasant valley where Psyche had her home. Eagerly as she awaited them, Psyche thought she might make the princely palace wherein she dwelt yet fairer than it was, and almost ere she could think, her thoughts became realities. When the two sisters came, they were bewildered with the beauty and the magnificence of it all. Beside this, their own possessions were paltry trifles indeed. Quickly, in their little hearts, black envy grew. They had always been jealous of their younger sister, and now that they found her, whom all the world believed to have been slain by a horrible monster, more beautiful than ever, decked with rare jewels, radiant in her happiness, and queen of a palace fit for the gods, their envy soon turned to hatred, and they sought how best to wreak their malice upon the joyous creature who loaded them with priceless gifts. They began to ply Psyche with questions. He who was her lord, to whom she owed all her happiness, where was he? Why did he stay away when her sisters came to be presented to him? What manner of man was he? Was he fair or dark, young or old? And as they questioned her, Psyche grew like a bewildered child, and answered in frightened words that contradicted one another. And well the wicked sisters, who brooded evil in their hearts, knew that this husband whom Psyche had never seen must indeed be one of the deathless gods. Wily words they spoke to her then. "Alas, unhappy one," they said, "dost think to escape the evil fate the gods meted out for thee? Thy husband is none other than the monster of which the oracle spake. O foolish Psyche, canst not understand that the monster fears the light? Too great horror would it mean for thee to see the loathsome thing that comes in the blackness of night and speaks to thee words of love." White-lipped and trembling, Psyche listened. Drop by drop, the poisonous words passed into her soul. She had thought him king of all living things, worthy to rule over gods as well as men. She was so sure that his body was worthy sheath for the heart she knew so well. She had pictured him beautiful as Eros, son of Aphrodite, young and fair, with crisp golden locks, a husband to glory in, a lover to adore. And now she knew, with shame and dread, that he who had won her love between the twilight and the dawn was a thing to shame her, a monster to be shunned of men. "What then shall I do?" piteously she asked her sisters. And the women piteously and well content answered, "Provide thyself with a lamp and a knife sharp enough to slay the man or monster. And when this creature to whom, to thy undying shame, thou belongest, sleep sound, slip from thy couch, and in the rays of the lamp Have courage to look upon him in all his horror. Then, when thou hast seen for thyself that what we say is truth, with thy knife swiftly slay him. Thus shalt thou free thyself from the pitiless doom meted out by the gods." Shaking with sobs, Psyche made answer, "I love him so, I love him so." And her sisters turned upon her with furious scorn and well-simulated wrath. "Shameless one," they cried, "and does our father's daughter confess to a thing so unutterable? Only by slaying the monster canst thou hope to regain thy place amongst the daughters of men." They left her when evening fell, carrying with them their royal gifts. And while she awaited the coming of her lord, Psyche, provided with knife and lamp, crouched with her head in her hands, a lily broken by a cruel storm. So glad was Eros to come back to her, to find her safely there, for greatly had he feared the coming of that treacherous pair, that he did not note her silence. Nor did the dark night show him that her eyes and her sad face looked like violets in a snow wreath. He wanted only to hold her safely in his arms, and there she lay, passive and still, until sleep came to lay upon him an omnipotent hand. Then, very gently, she withdrew herself from his embrace and stole to the place where her lamp was hidden. Her limbs shook under her as she brought it to the couch where he lay asleep. Her arm trembled as she held it aloft. As martyr walks to death, so did she walk. And when the yellow light fell upon the form of him who lay there, still she gazed steadily. And lo, before her she saw the form of him who had ever been the ideal of her dreams. Love himself, incarnate love, perfect in beauty and in all else, was he whom her sisters had told her was a monster. He of whom the oracle had said that neither gods nor men could resist him. For a moment of perfect happiness she gazed upon his beauty. Then he turned in his sleep and smiled, and stretched out his arms to find the one of his love. And Psyche started, and, starting, shook the lamp, and from it fell a drop of burning oil on the white shoulder of Eros. At once he awoke, and with piteous, pitying eyes looked in those of Psyche, and when he spoke, his words were like daggers that pierced deep into her soul. He told her all that had been, all that might have been. Had she only had faith and patience to wait, an immortal life should have been hers. Farewell. Though I, a god, can never know how thou canst lose thy pain, yet time will go over thine head, and thou mayest mingle yet the bitter and the sweet, nor quite forget, nor quite remember, till these things shall seem the wavering memory of a lovely dream. William Morris. He left her alone then, with her despair, and as the slow hours dragged by, Psyche, as she awaited the dawn, felt that in her heart no sun could ever rise again. When day came at last, she felt she could no longer endure to stay in the palace where everything spoke to her of the infinite tenderness of a lost love. Through the night a storm had raged, and even with the day there came no calm. And Psyche, weary and chill, wandered away from the place of her happiness, onward and ever on, until she stood on the bank of a swift-flowing river. For a little she stayed her steps and listened to the sound of its wash against the rocks and tree roots as it hurried past, and to her, as she waited, came the thought that here had she found a means by which to end her woe. "I have lost my love," she moaned. "What is life to me any longer? Come to me then, O Death." So then she sprang into the wan water, hoping that very swiftly it might bear her grief-worn soul down to the shades. But the river bore her up and carried her to its shallows in a fair meadow where Pan himself sat on the bank and merrily dabbled his feet in the flowing water. And when Psyche, shamed and wet, looked at him with sad eyes, the god spoke to her gently and chid her for her folly. She was too young and much too fair to try to end her life so rudely, he said. The river gods would never be so unkind as to drive so beautiful a maiden in rough haste down to the Cocytus valley. "Thou must dree thy weird like all other daughters of men, fair Psyche," he said. "He or she who fain would lose their lives are ever held longest in life. Only when the gods will it shall thy days on earth be done." And Psyche, knowing that in truth the gods had spared her to endure more sorrow, looked in his face with a very piteous gaze and wandered on. As she wandered, she found that her feet had led her near the place where her two sisters dwelt. "I shall tell them of the evil they have wrought," she thought. "Surely they must sorrow when they know that by their cruel words they stole my faith from me and robbed me of my love and of my happiness." Gladly the two women saw the stricken form of Psyche and looked at her face all marred by grief. Well indeed had their plot succeeded. Their malice had drunk deep, yet deeper still they drank, for with scornful laughter they drove her from their palace doors. Very quickly, when she had gone, the elder sought the place where she had stood when Zephyrus bore her in safety to that palace of pleasure where Psyche dwelt with her love. Now that Psyche was no longer there, surely the god by whom she had been beloved would gladly have as her successor the beautiful woman who was now much more fair than the white-faced girl with eyes all red with weeping. And such certainty did the vengeful gods put in her heart that she held out her arms, and calling aloud, "Bear me to him in thine arms, Zephyrus. Behold, I come, my lord." She sprang from the high cliff on which she stood into space, and the ravens that night feasted on her shattered body. So also did it befall the younger sister, deluded by the Olympians to her own destruction, so that her sin might be avenged. For many a weary day and night Psyche wandered, ever seeking to find her love, ever longing to do something by which to atone for the deed that had been her undoing. From temple to temple she went, but nowhere did she come near him, until at length in Cyprus she came to the place where Aphrodite herself had her dwelling. And inasmuch as her love had made her very bold, and because she no longer feared death, nor could think of pangs more cruel than those that she already knew, Psyche sought the presence of the goddess who was her enemy, and humbly begged her to take her life away. With flaming scorn and anger Aphrodite received her. "O thou fool," she said, "I will not let thee die. But thou shalt reap the harvest thou hast sown, and many a day that wretched lot bemoan. Thou art my slave, and not a day shall be but I will find some fitting task for thee." There began then for Psyche a time of torturing misery, of which only those could speak who have knowledge of the merciless stripes with which the goddess can scourge the hearts of her slaves. With cruel ingenuity Aphrodite invented labours for her. In uncountable quantity and mingled in inextricable and bewildering confusion, there lay in the granary of the goddess grains of barley and of wheat, peas and millet, poppy and coriander seed. To sort out each kind and lay them in heaps was the task allotted for one day, and woe be to her did she fail. In despair Psyche began her hopeless labour. While the sun shone through a day that was for her too short, she strove to separate the grains, but when the shadows of evening made it hard for her to distinguish one sort from another, only a few very tiny piles were the result of her weary toil. Very soon the goddess would return, and Psyche dared not think what would be the punishment meted out to her. Rapidly the darkness fell, but while the dying light still lingered in some parts of the granary, it seemed to Psyche as though little dark trickles of water began to pour from underneath the doors and through the cracks in the wall. Trembling, she watched the ceaseless motion of those long dark lines, and then, in amazement, realized that what she saw were unending processions of ants. And, as though one who loved her directed their labours, the millions of busy little toilers swiftly did for Psyche what she herself had failed to do. When at length they went away, in those long, dark lines that looked like the flow of a thread-like stream, the grains were all piled up in high heaps, and the sad heart of Psyche knew not only thankful relief, but had a thrill of gladness. "Eros sent them to me," she thought. "Even yet his love for me is not dead." And what she thought was true. Amazed and angry, Aphrodite looked at the task she had deemed impossible, well and swiftly performed. That Psyche should possess such magic skill only incensed her more, and next day she said to her new slave, "Behold, on the other side of that glittering stream my golden-fleeced sheep crop the sweet flowers of the meadow. To-day must thou cross the river and bring me back by evening a sample of wool pulled from each one of their shining fleeces." Then did Psyche go down to the brink of the river, and even as her white feet splashed into the water she heard a whisper of warning from the reeds that bowed their heads by the stream. "Beware, O Psyche," they said. "Stay on the shore and rest until the golden-fleeced sheep lie under the shade of the trees in the evening and the murmur of the river has lulled them to sleep." But Psyche said, "Alas, I must do the bidding of the goddess. It will take me many a weary hour to pluck the wool that she requires." And again the reeds murmured, "Beware, for the golden-fleeced sheep with their great horns are evil creatures that lust for the lives of mortals, and will slay thee even as thy feet reach the other bank. Only when the sun goes down does their vice depart from them, and while they sleep thou canst gather of their wool from the bushes and from the trunks of the trees." And again the heart of Psyche felt a thrill of happiness, because she knew that she was loved and cared for still. All day she rested in the wood by the river and dreamt pleasant daydreams, and when the sun had set she waded to the further shore and gathered the golden wool in the way that the reeds had told her. When in the evening she came to the goddess, bearing her shining load, the brow of Aphrodite grew dark. "If thou art so skilled in magic that no danger is danger to thee, yet another task shall I give thee that is worthy of thy skill," she said, and laid upon Psyche her fresh commands. Sick with dread, Psyche set out next morning to seek the black stream out of which Aphrodite had commanded her to fill a ewer. Part of its waters flowed into the Styx, part into the Cocytus, and well did Psyche know that a hideous death from the loathly creatures that protected the fountain must be the fate of those who risked so proud an attempt. Yet because she knew that she must dree her weird, as Pan had said, she plodded onward towards that dark mountain from whose side gushed the black water that she sought. And then once again there came to her a message of love. A whirring of wings she heard, and o'er her head there flew the bird of Jove, the bearer of his servant, friend of love, who, when he saw her, straightway towards her flew, and asked her why she wept, and when he knew, and who she was, he said, "Cease all thy fear, for to the black waves I thy ewer will bear, and fill it for thee. But remember me when thou art come unto thy majesty." And yet once again the stricken heart of Psyche was gladdened, and when at nightfall she came with her ewer full of water from the dread stream, and gave it to Aphrodite, although she knew that a yet more arduous task was sure to follow, her fear had all passed away. With beautiful sullen eyes Aphrodite received her when she brought the water, and with black brow she said, "If thou art so skilled in magic that no danger is known to thee, I shall now give thee a task all worthy of thy skill." Thereon she told her that she must seek that dark valley where no silver nor golden light ever strikes on the black waters of Cocytus and of the Styx, and where Pluto reigns in gloomy majesty over the restless shades. from Proserpine she was to crave for Aphrodite the gift of a box of magical ointment, the secret of which was known to the Queen of Darkness alone, and which was able to bring to those who used it beauty more exquisite than any that the eyes of gods or of men had as yet looked upon. "I grow weary and cave-worn," said Aphrodite, and she looked like a rose that has budded in paradise as she spoke. "My son was wounded by a faithless slave in whom most weakly he put his trust, and in tending to his wound my beauty has faded." And at these scornful words the heart of Psyche leaped within her. "In helping his mother I shall help him," she thought. And again she thought, "I shall atone." And so, when day was come, she took her way along the weary road that leads to that dark place from whence no traveller can ever hope to return, and still with gladness in her heart. But as she went onward, cold thoughts and dreadful fears came to her. "Better were it for me to hasten my journey to the shades," she thought. And when she came to an old grey tower, that seemed like an old man that death had forgotten, she resolved to throw herself down from it, and thus swiftly to find herself at her journey's end. But as she stood on the top of the tower, her arms outstretched like a white butterfly that poises its wings for flight, a voice spoke in her ear. "O foolish one," it said, "why dost thou strive to stay the hope that is not dead?" And while she held her breath, her great eyes wide open, the voice spoke on, and told her by what means she might speedily reach Hades, and there find means to face with courage the King of Darkness himself and his fair wife Proserpine. All that she was bidden to do Psyche did, and so at last did she come before the throne of Proserpine. And all that Psyche endured, all that she saw, all that through which she came with bleeding heart and yet with unscathed soul, cannot here be written. To her Proserpine gave the box of precious ointment that Aphrodite described, and gladly she hastened homeward. Good indeed it was to her when again she reached the fair light of day. Yet when she had won there came to Psyche a winged thought, that beat against the stern barriers of her mind like a little moth against a window. "This ointment that I carry with me," said Psyche to herself, "is an ointment that will bring back to those all faded by time or worn by suffering a beauty greater than any beauty that has joyed the immortals." And then she thought, "For my beauty, Eros, love, loved me, and now my beauty is worn and wasted and well nigh gone. Were I to open this box and make use of the ointment of Proserpine, then indeed I should be fair enough to be the bride of him who, even now, believes that he loves me, of Eros whose love is my life." So it came to pass that she opened the fateful box, and out of it there came not beauty, but sleep, that put his gyves upon her limbs, and on her eyelids laid heavy fingers. And Psyche sank down by the wayside, the prisoner of sleep. But Eros, who had loved her ever, with a love that knew the ebb and flow of no tides, rose from his bed and went in search of her who had braved even the horrors of Hades for his dear sake. And by the wayside he found her, fettered by sleep. Her little oval face was white as a snowdrop. Like violets were her heavy eyelids, and underneath her sleeping eyes a violet shadow lay. Once had her mouth been as the bow of Eros, painted in carmine. Now either end of the bow was turned downwards, and its colour was that of a faded rose leaf. And as Eros looked at her that he loved, pity stirred his heart, as the wind sweeps through the sighing grey leaves of the willow, or sings through the bowing reeds. "My beloved," he said, and he knew that Psyche was indeed his beloved. It was her fair soul that he loved. Nor did it matter to him whether her body was like a rose in June or as a wind-scourged tree in December. And as his lips met hers, Psyche awoke and heard his soft whisper, "Dear, unclose thine eyes. Thou mayest look on me now. I go no more, but am thine own forever." Lewis Morris. Then did there spring from the fair white shoulders of Psyche wings of silver and of gold, and hand in hand with Eros she winged her way to Olympus. And there all the deathless gods were assembled, and Aphrodite no longer looked upon her who had once been her slave with darkened brows, but smiled upon her as the sun smiles upon a new-born flower. And when into the hand of Psyche there was placed a cup of gold, the voice of the great Father and King of Olympus rang out loud and clear, "Drink now, O beautiful, and have no fear, for with this draught shalt thou be born again, and live forever, free from care and pain." William Morris. In this wise did Psyche, a human soul, attain by bitter suffering to the perfect happiness of purified love. And still do we watch the butterfly, which is her emblem, bursting from its ugly tomb in the dark soil, and spreading joyous white and gold-powdered wings in the caressing sunshine, amidst the radiance and the fragrance of the summer flowers. Still, too, do we sadly watch her sister, the white moth, heedlessly rushing into pangs unutterable, thoughtlessly seeking the anguish that brings her a cruel death. End of Psyche. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 8 of A Book of Myths. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. A Book of Myths by Jane Lang. Section 8. The Caledonian Hunt. Aeneas and Althea were king and queen of Caledon, and to them was born a son who was his mother's joy and yet her bitterest sorrow. Meleager was his name, and ere his birth his mother dreamed a dream that the child that she bore was a burning firebrand. But when the baby came, he was a royal child indeed, a little fearless king, from the first moment that his eyes, like unseeing violets, gazed steadily up at his mother. To the chamber where he lay by his mother's side came the three Fates, spinning, ceaselessly spinning. "He shall be strong," said one, as she span her thread. "He shall be fortunate and brave," said the second. But the third laid a billet of wood on the flames, and while her withered fingers held the fatal threads, she looked with old, old sad eyes at the newborn child. "To thee, O newborn," she said, "and to this wood that burns do we give the same span of days to live." From her bed sprang Althea, and heedless of the flames, she seized the burning wood, trod on it with her fair white feet, and poured on it water that swiftly quenched its red glow. "Thou shalt live forever, O beloved," she said, "for never again shall fire char the brand that I have plucked from the burning." And the baby laughed. Those grey women with bound hair, who fright the gods, frighted not him. He laughed, seeing them, and pushed out hands to feel and haul distaff and thread. The years sped on, and from fearless and beautiful babyhood Meleager grew into gallant boyhood, and then into magnificent youth. When Jason and his heroes sailed away into a distant land to win the Golden Fleece, Meleager was one of the noble band. From all men living he won great praise for his brave deeds. And when the tribes of the north and west made war upon Ætolia, he fought against their army and scattered it as a wind in autumn drives the fallen leaves before it. But his victory brought evil upon him. When his father Aeneas, at the end of a fruitful year, offered sacrifices to the gods, he omitted to honour the goddess Diana by sacrificing to her, and to punish his neglect, she had sent this destroying army. When Meleager was victor, her wrath against his father grew yet more hot, and she sent a wild boar, large as the bulls of Epirus, and fierce and savage, to kill and to devour, that it might ravage and lay waste the land of Caledon. The fields of corn were trampled underfoot, the vineyards laid waste, and the olive groves wrecked as by a winter hurricane. Flocks and herds were slaughtered by it, or driven hither and thither in wild panic, working havoc as they fled. Many went out to slay it, but went only to find a hideous death. Then did Meleager resolve that he would rid the land of this monster, and called on all his friends, the heroes of Greece, to come to his aid. Theseus and his friend Pirithous came, Jason, Peleus, afterwards father of Achilles, Telamon, the father of Ajax, Nestor, then but a youth, Castor and Pollux, and Toxeus and Plexippus, the brothers of Althea, the fair queen-mother. But there came none more fearless, nor more ready to fight the monster boar of Caledon, than Atalanta, the daughter of the king of Arcadia. When Atalanta was born, her father heard of her birth with anger. He desired no daughter, but only sturdy sons who might fight for him, and in the furious rage of bitter disappointment he had the baby princess left on the Parthenian hill, that she might perish there. A she-bear heard the baby's piteous cries, and carried it off to its lair, where she suckled it along with her young, and there the little Atalanta tumbled about and played with her furry companions, and grew strong and vigorous as any other wild young creature of the forest. Some hunters came one day to raid the den and kill the foster mother, and found, amazed, a fearless, white-skinned thing with rosy cheeks and brave eyes, who fought for her life and bit them as did her fierce foster brothers, and then cried human tears of rage and sorrow when she saw the bear who had been her mother lying bloody and dead. Under the care of the hunters, Atalanta grew into a maiden, with all the beauty of a maid and all the strength and the courage of a man. She ran as swiftly as Zephyrus runs when he rushes up from the west and drives the white clouds before him like a flock of timid fawns that a hound is pursuing. The shafts that her strong arm sped from her bow smote straight to the heart of the beast that she chased, and almost as swift as her arrow was she there to drive her spear into her quarry. When at length her father, the king, learned that the beautiful huntress, of whom all men spoke as of one only a little lower than Diana, was none other than his daughter, he was not slow to own her as his child. So proud was he of her beauty and grace, and of her marvellous swiftness of foot and skill in the chase, that he would fain have married her to one of the great ones of Greece. But Atalanta had consulted an oracle. "Marry not," said the oracle. "To thee marriage must bring woe." So, with untouched heart, and with the daring and the courage of a young lad, Atalanta came along with the heroes to the Caledonian hunt. She was so radiantly lovely, so young, so strong, so courageous, that straightway Meleager loved her, and all the heroes gazed at her with eyes that adored her beauty. And Diana, looking down at her, also loved the maiden whom from childhood she had held in her protection, a gallant, fearless virgin, dear to her heart. The grey mist rose from the marshes as the hunt began, and the hunters of the boar had gone but a little way when they came upon traces of the hated boar. Disembowelled beasts marked its track. Here, in a flowery meadow, had it wallowed. There, in rich wheat land, had it rooted, and the marks of its bestial tusks were on the gashed grey trunks of the trees that had once lived in the peace of a fruitful olive grove. In a marsh they found their enemy, and all the reeds quivered as it heaved its vast bulk, and hove aside the weed in which it had wallowed, and rooted with its tusks amongst the wounded water lilies before it leapt with a snort to meet and to slay the men who had come against it. A filthy thing it was, as its pink snout rose above the green ooze of the marshes, and it looked up lustingly, defying the purity of the blue skies of heaven, to bring to those who came against it a cruel, shameful death. Upon it first of all Jason cast his spear, but the sharp point only touched it, and unwounded the boar rushed on, its gross bristly head down, to disembowel, if it could, the gallant Nestor. In the branches of a tree Nestor found safety, and Telamon rushed on to destroy the filthy thing that would have made carrion of the sons of the gods. A straggling cypress root caught his fleeting foot and laid him prone, a helpless prey for the rooting brute. His hounds fell before it, but ere it could reach him, Atalanta, full of vengeful rage, the pure angered against the filthy and cruel, let draw her bow with a prayer to Diana to guide her shaft aright. Into the boar's smoking flank sped the arrow. The sudden string rang and sprang inward, and the waterish air hissed, and the moist plumes of the songless reeds moved as a wave which the wind moves no more. But the boar heaved, half out of ooze and slime, his tense flank trembling round the barbed wound, hateful and fiery, with invasive eyes and bristling with intolerable hair, plunged, and the hounds clung, and green flowers and white reddened and broke all round them where they came. And charging with sheer tusk he drove, and smote Hyleus, and sharp death caught his sudden soul, and violent sleep shed night upon his eyes. Swinburne. More than ever terrible was the monster now that it was wounded. One after the other the hunters fell before its mad rage, and were sent to the shades by a bloody and merciless death. Before its furious charge even the heart of a hero might have been stricken. Yet Meleager, like a mighty oak of the forest that will not sway even a little before the rush of a storm, stood full in its way and met its onslaught. Aimed on the left side, his well-handled spear grasped where the ash was knottiest hewn, and smote. And with no missile wound, the monstrous bore right in the hairiest hollow of his hide, under the last rib, sheer through bulk and bone, deep in, and deeply smitten, and to death the heavy horror, with his hanging shafts, leapt and fell furiously, and from raging lips foamed out the latest wrath of all his life. Great was the shout that rose from those who still lived when that grim hunt thus came to an end. And when with his keen blade Meleager struck off the head, even as the quivering throat drew its last agonized breath, louder still shouted the men of Greece. But not for himself did Meleager despoil the body of his foe. He laid the ugly thing at the feet of Atalanta. "This is thy spoil, not mine," he said. "The wounding shaft was sped by thee. To thee belongs the praise." And Atalanta blushed rosily and laughed low and gladly, not only because Diana had heard her prayer and helped her slay the beast, but for happiness that Meleager was so noble in his giving. At that the brows of the heroes grew dark, and angrily one cried, "Lo now! Shall not the Arcadian shoot out lips at us, saying all we were despoiled by this one girl?" Like a spark that kindles the dry grass, their kindling anger spread, and they rushed against Atalanta, seized the trophy she had been given, and smote her as though she were but a shameless wanton, and not the noble daughter of a king. And because the heart of Meleager was given very wholly to the fair huntress, and because those whom he deemed his friends had not only dishonoured her, but had done him a very grievous wrong, a great rage seized him. Right and left he smote, and they who had been most bitter in their jealousy of Atalanta, the two brothers of his own mother, were laid low in death. Tidings of the slaying of the boar had been brought to Althea by swift messengers, and she was on her way to the temples bearing gifts to the gods for the victory of her son, when she beheld the slow-footed procession of those who bore the bodies of the dead. And when she saw the still faces of her two dear brothers, quickly was her joy turned into mourning. Terrible was her grief and anger when she learned by whose hand they were slain, and her mother's love and pride dried up in her heart like the clear water of a fountain before the scorching of a devouring fire. No sacrifices to the gods would she offer, but her dead brothers should have the greatest sacrifice that mother could make to atone for the guilt of her son. Back to the palace she went, and from its safe hiding place drew out the brand that she had rescued from the flames when Meleager, the hero, was but a babe that made his mother's heart sing for joy. She commanded a fire to be prepared, and 4 times, as its flames blazed aloft, she tried to lay the brand upon the pile. Yet 4 times she drew back, and then at last she threw into the reddest of the ashes the charred brand that for a little she held so close to her breast that it seemed as though she fondled her child. A wreath of leaves, as sign of victory, was being placed on Atalanta's beautiful head by the adoring hands of Meleager when his mother gave him his doom. Through his body there rushed a pang of mortal agony. His blood turned to fire, and the hand of death that smote him was as a hand of molten lead. In torture his gallant spirit passed away, uncomplaining, loving through his pain the maid for whose dear sake he had brought woe upon himself. As the last white ashes in the fire crumbled and fell away into nothingness, the soul of Meleager departed. Swiftly through the dark valley his mother's shade followed him, for she fell upon a sword and so perished. And Diana, looking down on the grief-stricken sisters of Meleager and on the bitter sorrow of his father, had compassion on them and turned them into birds. So ended the Caledonian hunt, and Atalanta returned to Arcadia, heavy at heart for the evil she had wrought unwittingly. And still the 3 fates span on, and the winds caught up the cold wood ashes and blew them across the ravaged land that Meleager had saved and that quickly grew fertile again. End of The Caledonian Hunt. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 9 of A Book of Myths. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. A Book of Myths by Jean Lang. Section 9. Atalanta. Atalanta, daughter of the king of Arcadia, returned sad at heart to her own land. Only as comrades, as those against whose skill in the chase she was wont to pit her own skill, had she looked upon men. But Meleager, the hero who loved her and her fair honour more than life itself, and whose love had made him haste in all his gallant strength and youthful beauty to the land of the Shades, was one to touch her as never before had she been touched. Her father, proud of her triumph in Caledon, again besought her to marry one of her many noble suitors. "If indeed they love me as thou sayest," said Atalanta to her father, "then must they be ready to face for my sake even the loss of dear life itself. I shall be the prize of him who outruns me in a foot race, but he who tries and fails must pay to death his penalty." Thereafter, for many days, a strange sight was to be seen in Arcadia, for one after another the suitors came to race with the maiden whose face had bewitched them, though truly the race was no more fair to him who ran than would be a race with death. No mortal man was as fleet as Atalanta, who had first raced with the wild things of the mountains and the forests, and who had dared at last to race with the winds and leave even them behind. To her it was all a glorious game. Her conquest was always sure, and if the youths who entered in the contest cared to risk their lives, why should they blame her? So each day they started, throbbing hope and fierce determination to win her in the heart of him who ran, fading hope and despairing anger as he saw her skimming ahead of him like a gay-hued butterfly that a tired child pursues in vain. And each day, as the race ended, another man paid the price of his defeat. Daily, amongst those who looked on, stood her cousin Milanion. He would fain have hated Atalanta for her ruthlessness and her joyousness as he saw his friends die for her sake. Yet daily her beauty, her purity, and her gallant unconsciousness took a firmer hold upon his heart. To himself he vowed that he would win Atalanta, but not without help from the gods was this possible. Therefore he sought Aphrodite herself and asked her aid. Milanion was a beautiful youth, and to Aphrodite, who loved beauty, he pled his cause, as he told her how Atalanta had become to him more than life, so that he had ceased to pity the youths, his friends, who had died for love of her. The goddess smiled upon him with gentle sympathy. In the garden of her temple grew a tree with branches and twigs of gold, and leaves as yellow as the little leaves of the silver birch when the autumn sun kisses them as it sets. On this tree grew golden apples, and Aphrodite plucked 3 of them and gave them to the youth who had not feared to ask her to aid him to win the maid he loved. How he was to use the apples she then told him, and well content, Milanion returned home. Next day he spoke to Atalanta. "So far has victory been thine, fairest on earth," he said, "but so far have thy little winged white feet had only the heavy-footed laggards to outrun. Wilt have me run a race with thee? For assuredly I shall win thee for my own." And Milanion looked into the eyes of Atalanta with a smile as gay and fearless as that with which a hero is wont to look in the eyes of his fellow. Look for look did the virgin huntress give him. Then her cheeks grew red, as though the rosy-fingered dawn had touched them, and the dawning of love came into her heart. Even Meleager was not quite so goodly a youth as this. Not even Meleager had been so wholly fearless. "Thou art tempted by the deathless gods," she said, but her long lashes drooped on her cheek as she spoke. "I pity you, Milanion, for when thou dost race with me, the goal is assuredly the meadows of Asphodel, near where sit Pluto and Persephone on their gloomy thrones." But Milanion said, "I am ready, Atalanta. Wilt race with me now?" And steadily he looked in her eyes until again they fell as though at last they had found a conqueror. Like 2 swallows that skim across a sunny sea, filled with the joyousness of the coming of spring, Atalanta and Milanion started. Scarcely did their feet seem to touch the solid earth, and all those who stood by vowed that now, at length, was a race indeed, a race worthy for the gods to behold. But as they ran, almost abreast, so that none could tell which was the gainer, Milanion obeyed the bidding of Aphrodite and let fall one of the golden apples. Never before had Atalanta dreamed of such a thing. An apple of glistening gold! She stopped, poised on one foot as a flying bird poises for a moment on the wing, and picked up the treasure. But Milanion had sped several paces ahead ere she was again abreast of him, and even as she gained on him, he dropped the second apple. Again Atalanta was tempted. Again she stopped, and again Milanion shot ahead of her. her breath came short and fast, as once more she gained the ground that she had lost. But yet a third time Milanion threw in her way one of the golden illusions of the gods, and yet again Atalanta stooped to pick up the apple of gold. Then a mighty shout from those who watched rent the air, and Atalanta, half fearful, half ashamed, yet wholly happy, found herself running vanquished into the arms of him who was indeed her conqueror. For not only had Milanion won the race, but he had won the heart of the virgin huntress, a heart once as cold and remote as the winter snow on the peak of Mount Olympus. End of Atalanta. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 10 of A Book of Myths. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. A Book of Myths by Jean Lang. Section 10. Arachne. The hay that so short a time ago was long, lush grass, with fragrant meadowsweet and gold-eyed marguerites growing amongst it in the green meadowland by the river, is now dry hay, fragrant still, though dead, and hidden from the sun's warm rays underneath the dark wooden rafters of the barn. Occasionally a cat on a hunting foray comes into the barn to look for mice, or to nestle cosily down into purring slumber. Now and then a hen comes furtively tiptoeing through the open door, and makes for itself a secret nest in which to lay the eggs which it subsequently heralds with such loud clucks of proud rejoicing as to completely undo all its previous precautions. Sometimes children come in, pursuing cat or hen, or merely to tumble each other over amongst the soft hay which they leave in chaotic confusion, and when they have gone away, a little more of the sky can be seen through the little window in the roof, and through the wooden bars of the window lower down. Yet whatever other living creatures may come or go by those windows of the barn, and high up on its dark rafters, there is always a living creature working, ceaselessly working. When through the skylight the sun god drives a golden sunbeam, and a long shaft of dancing dust atoms passes from the window to what was once a part of the early summer's glory, the work of the unresting toiler is also to be seen. For the window is hung with shimmering grey tapestries made by Arachne, the spider, and from rafter to rafter her threads are suspended with inimitable skill. She was a nymph once, they say, the daughter of Idmon, the dyer, of Colophon, a city of Lydia. In all Lydia there was none who could weave as wove the beautiful Arachne. To watch her card the wool of the white-fleeced sheep, until in her fingers it grew like the soft clouds that hang round the hilltops, was pleasure enough to draw nymphs from the golden river Pactolus and from the vineyards of Tmolus. And when she drove her swift shuttle hither and thither, still it was joy to watch her wondrous skill. Magical was the growth of the web, fine of woof, that her darting fingers span, and yet more magical the exquisite devices that she then wrought upon it. For birds and flowers and butterflies and pictures of all the beautiful things on earth were limned by Arachne, and old tales grew alive again under her creative needle. To Pallas Athena, goddess of craftsmen, came tidings that at Colophon in Lydia lived a nymph whose skill rivalled that of the goddess herself, and she, ever jealous for her own honour, took on herself the form of a woman bent with age, and, leaning on her staff, joined the little crowd that hung round Arachne as she plied her busy needle. With white arms twined round each other, the eager nymphs watched the flowers spring up under her fingers, even as flowers spring from the ground on the coming of Demeter, and Athena was fain to admire while she marvelled at the magic skill of the fair Arachne. Gently she spoke to Arachne, and with the persuasive words of a wise old woman, warned her that she must not let her ambition soar too high. Greater than all skilled craftswomen was the great goddess Athena, and were Arachne, in impious vanity, to dream that one day she might equal her, that were indeed a crime for any god to punish. Glancing up for a moment from the picture whose perfect colours grew fast under her slim fingers, Arachne fixed scornful eyes on the old woman and gave a merry laugh. "Didst say equal, Athena, old mother?" she said. "In good sooth thy dwelling must be with the goatherds in the far-off hills, and thou art not a dweller in our city, else hadst thou not spoken to Arachne of equalling the work of Athena. Excelling were the better word." In anger, Pallas Athena made answer. "Impious one," she said, "to those who would make themselves higher than the gods must ever come woe unutterable. Take heed what thou sayest, for punishment will assuredly be thine." Laughing still, Arachne made reply: "I fear not Athena, nor does my heart shake at the gloomy warning of a foolish old crone." And turning to the nymphs, who, half afraid, listened to her daring words, she said: "Fair nymphs, who watch me day by day, well do ye know that I make no idle boast. My skill is as great as that of Athena, and greater still it shall be. Let Athena try a contest with me if she dare. Well do I know who will be the victor." Then Athena cast off her disguise, and before the frightened nymphs and the bold Arachne stood the radiant goddess with eyes that blazed with anger and insulted pride. "Lo, Athena is come," she said, and nymphs and women fell on their knees before her, humbly adoring. Arachne alone was unabashed. Her cheeks showed how fast her heart was beating. From rosy red to white went the colour in them. Yet in firm, low voice she spoke. "I have spoken truth," she said. "Not woman nor goddess can do work such as mine. Ready am I to abide by what I have said, and if I did boast, by my boast I stand. If thou wilt deign, great goddess, to try thy skill against the skill of the dyer's daughter, and dost prove the victor, behold me gladly willing to pay the penalty." The eyes of Athena, the grey-eyed goddess, grew dark as the sea when a thundercloud hangs over it and a mighty storm is coming. Not for one moment did she delay, but took her place by the side of Arachne. On the loom they stretched out two webs with a fine warp, and made them fast on the beam. The sleigh separates the warp. The woof is inserted in the middle with sharp shuttles, which the fingers hurry along, and, being drawn within the warp, the teeth, notched in the moving sleigh, strike it. Both hasten on, and, girding up their garments to their breasts, they move their skilful arms, their eagerness beguiling their fatigue. There both the purple is being woven, which is subjected to the Tyrian brazen vessel, and fine shades of minute difference. Just as the rainbow, with its mighty arch, is wont to tint a long tract of sky by means of the rays reflected by the shower, in which, though 1,000 different colours are shining, yet the very transition eludes the eyes that look upon it. There, too, the pliant gold is mixed with the threads. Ovid. Their canvases wrought, then did Athena and Arachne hasten to cover them with pictures such as no skilled worker of tapestry has ever since dreamed of accomplishing. Under the fingers of Athena grew up pictures so real and so perfect that the watchers knew not whether the goddess was indeed creating life. And each picture was one that told of the omnipotence of the gods, and of the doom that came upon those mortals who had dared in their blasphemous presumption to struggle as equals with the immortal dwellers in Olympus. Arachne glanced up from her web and looked with eyes that glowed with the love of beautiful things at the creations of Athena. Yet, undaunted, her fingers still sped on, and the goddess saw, with brow that grew yet more clouded, how the daughter of Idmon, the dyer, had chosen for subjects the tales that showed the weaknesses of the gods. One after another, the living pictures grew beneath her hand, and the nymphs held their breath in mingled fear and ecstasy at Arachne's godlike skill and most arrogant daring. Between goddess and mortal none could have chosen, for the colour and form and exquisite fancy of the pictures of the daughter of Zeus were equalled, though not excelled, by those of the daughter of the dyer of Colophon. Darker and yet more dark grew the eyes of Athena as they looked on the magical beauty of the pictures, each one of which was an insult to the gods. What picture had skilful hand ever drawn to compare with that of Europa, who, riding on the back of the divine bull, with one hand clasped the beast's great horn, and with the other caught up her garment's purple fold, lest it might trail and be drenched in the hoar sea's infinite spray. And her deep robe was blown out in the wind like the sail of a ship, and lightly ever it wafted the maiden onward. Mausius. Then at last did the storm break, and with her shuttle the enraged goddess smote the web of Arachne, and the fair pictures were rent into motley rags and ribbons. Furiously, too, with her shuttle of boxwood she smote Arachne. Before her rage the nymphs fled back to their golden river and to the vineyards of Tmolus, and the women of Colophon in blind terror rushed away. And Arachne, shamed to the dust, knew that life for her was no longer worth possessing. She had aspired, in the pride of her splendid genius, to a contest with a god, and knew now that such a contest must ever be vain. A cord hung from the weaver's beam, and swiftly she seized it, knotted it round her white neck, and would have hanged herself. But ere the life had passed out of her, Athena grasped the cord, loosened it, and spoke Arachne's doom. "Live," she said, "O guilty and shameless one. For evermore shalt thou live and hang as now, thou and thy descendants, that men may never forget the punishment of the blasphemous one who dared to rival a god." Even as she spoke, Arachne's fair form dried up and withered. Her straight limbs grew grey and crooked and wiry, and her white arms were no more. And from the beam where the beautiful weaver of Lydia had been suspended there hung from a fine grey thread the creature from which to this day there are but few who do not turn with loathing. Yet still Arachne spins, and still is without a compeer. Not any damsel which her vaunted most in skilful knitting of soft silken twine, nor any weaver which his work doth boast in deeper, in damask, or in line, nor any skilled in workmanship embossed, nor any skilled in loops of fingering fine, might in their diverse cunning ever dare with this so curious network to compare. Spenser. Thus, perhaps, does Arachne have her compensations, and in days that followed, long after the twilight of the gods, did she not gain eternal honour in the heart of every Scot by the tale of how she saved a national hero? Kindly, too, are her labours for men as she slays their mortal enemies, the household flies, and when the peasant, practical if not favoured by Aesculapius and Hygeia, runs to raid the loom of Arachne in order to staunch the quick-flowing blood from the cut hand of her little child, much more dear to her heart is Arachne the spider than the unknown Athena. Also in spinners be tokens of divination and of knowing what weather shall fall, for oft by weathers that shall fall some spin or weave higher or lower. Also multitude of spinners is token of much rain. Bartholomew. The sun has not long enough shown his face to dry up the dew in the garden, and behold on the little clipped tree of boxwood a great marvel, for in and out, and all over its twigs and leaves Arachne has woven her web, and on the web the dew has dropped 1,000,000 diamond drops. And suddenly all the colours in the sky are mirrored dazzlingly on the grey tapestry of her making. Arachne has come to her own again. End of Arachne. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 11 of A Book of Myths. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. A Book of Myths by Jean Lang. Section 11. Idas and Marpessa. By day, while the sun god drove his chariot in the high heavens and turned the blue-green Aegean Sea into the semblance of a blazing shield of brass, Idas and Marpessa sat together in the trees' soft shades, or walked in shadowy valleys where violets and wild parsley grew, and where Apollo rarely deigned to come. At eventide, when, in royal splendour of purple and crimson and gold, Apollo sought his rest in the western sky, Idas and Marpessa wandered by the seashore watching the little wavelets softly kissing the pebbles on the beach, or climbed to the mountain side, from whence they could see the first glimpse of Diana's silver crescent and the twinkling lights of the Pleiades breaking through the blue canopy of the sky. While Apollo sought in heaven and on earth the best means to gratify his imperial whims, Idas, for whom all joys had come to mean but one, sought ever to be by the side of Marpessa. Shadowy valley, murmuring sea, lonely mountainside, or garden where grew the purple amaranth, and where roses of pink and amber yellow and deepest crimson dropped their radiant petals on the snowy marble paths, all were the same to Idas. Paradise for him were Marpessa by his side. Without her, dreary desert. More beautiful than any flower that grew in the garden was Marpessa. No music that Apollo's lute could make was as sweet in the ears of Idas as her dear voice. Its music was ever new to him, a melody to make his heart more quickly throb. New, too, ever was her beauty. For him it was always the first time that they met, always the same fresh ravishment to look in her eyes. And when to Idas came the knowledge that Marpessa gave him love for love, he had indeed won happiness so great as to draw upon him the envy of the gods. The course of true love never did run smooth, and, like many and many another father since his day, Evenos, the father of Marpessa, was bitterly opposed to a match where the bridegroom was rich only in youth, in health, and in love. His beautiful daughter naturally seemed to him worthy of something much more high. Thus it was an unhappy day for Marpessa when, as she sat alone by the fountain which dripped slowly down on the marble basin, and dreamed of her lover Idas, Apollo himself, led by caprice, noiselessly walked through the rose bushes, whose warm petals dropped at his feet as he passed, and beheld a maiden more fair than the fairest flower that grew. The hum of bees, the drip, drip of the fountain, these lulled her mind and heart and soothed her daydreams. And Marpessa's red lips, curved like the bow of Eros, smiled as she thought of Idas, the man she loved. Silently Apollo watched her. This queen of all the roses was not fit to be the bride of mortal man. Marpessa must be his. To Evenos Apollo quickly imparted his desire. He was not used to having his imperial wishes denied, nor was Evenos anxious to do so. Here indeed was a match for his daughter, no insignificant mortal, but the radiant sun god himself, and to Marpessa he told what Apollo wished, and Marpessa shyly looked at her reflection in the pool of the fountain and wondered if she were indeed beautiful enough to win the love of a god. "Am I in truth so wondrous fair?" she asked her father. "Fair enough to mate with Apollo himself," proudly answered Evenos. And joyously Marpessa replied, "Ah, then am I happy indeed. I would be beautiful for my Idas's sake." An angry man was her father. There was to be no more pleasant dallying with Idas in the shadowy wood or by the seashore. In the rose garden Apollo took his place and charmed Marpessa's ears with his music, while her eyes could not but be charmed by his beauty. The god had no doubts or fears. Only a little time would he give her, for a very little only would he wait, and then undoubtedly this mortal maiden would be his, her heart conquered as assuredly as the rays from his chariot conquered the roses, whose warm crimson petals they strewed at his feet. Yet as Marpessa looked and listened, her thoughts were often far away, and always her heart was with Idas. When Apollo played most exquisitely to her, it seemed that he put her love for Idas into music. When he spoke to her of his love, she thought, "Thus and thus did Idas speak," and a sudden memory of the human lad's halting words brought to her heart a little gush of tenderness, and made her eyes sparkle, so that Apollo gladly thought, "Soon she will be mine." And all this while Idas schemed and plotted, and planned a way in which he could save his dear one from her obdurate father, and from the passion of a god. He went to Neptune, told his tale, and begged him to lend him a winged chariot in which he could fly away with Marpessa. Neptune good naturedly consented, and when Idas flew up from the seashore one day, like a great bird that the tempests have blown inland, Marpessa joyously sprang up beside her lover, and swiftly they took flight for a land where in peace they might live and love together. No sooner did Evenos realise that his daughter was gone, than, in furious anger against her and her lover, he gave chase. One has watched a hawk in pursuit of a pigeon or a bird of the moors and seen it, a little dark speck at first, gradually growing larger and more large, until at length it dominated and conquered its prey, swooping down from above, like an arrow from a bow, to bring with it sudden death. So at first it seemed that Evenos must conquer Idas and Marpessa in the winged chariot of Neptune's lending. But onwards Idas drove the chariot, ever faster and faster, until before the eyes of Marpessa the trees of the forest grew into blurs of blue and brown, and the streams and rivers, as they flew past them, were streaks of silver. Not until he had reached the river Lycormas did the angry father own that his pursuit had been in vain. Over the swift flowing stream flew the chariot driven by Idas, but Evenos knew that his horses, flecked with white foam, pumping each breath from hearts that were strained to breaking point, no longer could go on with the chase. The passage of that deep stream would destroy them. The fierce water would sweep the wearied beasts down in its impelling current, and he with them. A shamed man would he be forever. Not for a moment did he hesitate, but drew his sharp sword from his belt and plunged it into the breast of one steed, and then of the other, who had been so willing and who yet had failed him in the end. And then, as they, still in their traces, neighed shrilly aloud, and then fell over and died where they lay, Evenos, with a great cry, leaped into the river. Over his head closed the eddies of the peat-brown water. Once only did he throw up his arms to ask the gods for mercy. Then did his body drift down with the stream, and his soul hasten downwards to the shades. And from that day the river Lycormas no more was known by that name, but was called the river Evenos forever. Onwards triumphantly drove Idas, but soon he knew that a greater than Evenos had entered in the chase, and that the jealous sun god's chariot was in pursuit of the winged car of Neptune. Quickly it gained on him. Soon it would have swept down on him, a hawk indeed, this time striking surely its helpless prey. But even as Apollo saw the white face of Marpessa and knew that he was the victor, a mighty thunderbolt that made the mountains shake and rolled its echoes through the lonely fastnesses of 1,000 hills, was sent to earth by Jupiter. While the echoes still re-echoed, there came from Olympus the voice of Zeus himself. "Let her decide," he said. Apollo, like a white flame blown backward by the wind, withheld his hands that would have seized from Idas the woman who was his heart's desire. And then he spoke, and while his burning gaze was fixed upon her, and his face, in beautiful fury, was more perfect than any exquisite picture of her dreams, his voice was as the voice of the sea as it calls to the shore in the moonlit hours, as the bird that sings in the darkness of a tropic night to its longing mate. "Marpessa!" he cried. "Marpessa! Wilt thou not come to me? No woe nor trouble, never any pain can touch me. Yet woe indeed was mine when first I saw thy fairest face. For even now dost thou hasten to sorrow, to darkness, to the dark-shadowed tomb. Thou art but mortal. Thy beauty is short-lived. Thy love for mortal man shall quickly fade and die. Come to me, Marpessa, and my kisses on your lips shall make thee immortal. Together we shall bring the sunbeams to a cold, dark land. Together shall we coax the spring flowers from the still, dead earth. Together we shall bring to men the golden harvest, and deck the trees of autumn in our liveries of red and gold. I love thee, Marpessa. Not as mere mortal loves do I love thee. Come to me, Marpessa, my love, my desire." When his voice was silent, it seemed as if the very earth itself, with all its 1,000 echoes, still breathed his words. "Marpessa, my love, my desire." Abashed before the god's entreaties stood Idas, and the heart of Marpessa was torn as she heard the burning words of the beautiful Apollo still ringing through her head, and saw her mortal lover silent, white-lipped, gazing first at the god and then into her own pale face. At length he spoke. "After such argument what can I plead, or what pale promise make? Yet since it is in woman to pity rather than to aspire, a little I will speak. I love thee, then, not only for thy body packed with sweet of all this world, that cup of brimming June, that jar of violet wine set in the air, that palest rose sweet in the night of life, nor for that stirring bosom all besieged by drowsing lovers or thy perilous hair, nor for that face that might indeed provoke invasion of old cities. No, nor all thy freshness stealing on me like strange sleep. Nor for this only do I love thee, but because infinity upon thee broods, and thou art full of whispers and of shadows. Thou meanest what the sea has striven to say so long, and yearned up the cliffs to tell. Thou art what all the winds have uttered not, what the still night suggesteth to the heart. Thy voice is like to music heard ere birth, some spirit lute touched on a spirit sea. Thy face remembered is from other worlds. It has been died for, though I know not when. It has been sung of, though I know not where. It has the strangeness of the luring west, and of sad sea horizons. Beside thee I am aware of other times and lands, of birth far back, of lives in many stars. O beauty lone, and like a candle clear in this dark country of the world, thou art my woe, my early light, my music dying. Stephen Phillips. Then Idas, in the humility that comes from perfect love, drooped low his head and was silent. In silence for a minute stood the three, a god, a man, and a woman. And from on high the watching stars looked down and marvelled, and Diana stayed for a moment the course of her silver car to watch, as she thought, the triumph of her own invincible brother. From man to God passed the eyes of Marpessa, and back from God to man, and the stars forgot to twinkle, and Diana's silver-maned horses pawed the blue floor of the sky, impatient at the firm hand of the mistress on the reins that checked their eager course. Marpessa spoke at last in low words that seemed to come remembered from other worlds. For all the joys he offered her she thanked Apollo. What grander fate for mortal woman than to rule the sunbeams, to bring bliss to the earth and to the sons of men? What more could mortal woman crave than the gift of immortality shared with one whose power ruled the vast universe, and who still had stooped to lay the red roses of his passionate love at her little human feet? And yet, in that sorrow-free existence that he promised, might there not still be something a-wanting to one who had once known tears? Yet I, being human, human sorrow miss. Then, were he indeed to give her the gift of immortal life, what value were life to one whose beauty had withered as the leaves in autumn, whose heart was tired and dead? What uglier fate than this, to endure an endless existence in which no life was yoked to one whose youth was immortal, whose beauty was everlasting? Then did she turn to Idas, who stood as one who awaits the judgment of the judge in whose hands lies the power of meting out life or death. Thus she spoke: "But if I live with Idas, then we two on the low earth shall prosper hand in hand in odours of the open field, and live in peaceful noises of the farm, and watch the pastoral fields burned by the setting sun. And he shall give me passionate children, not some radiant god that will despise me quite, but clambering limbs and little hearts that err. So shall we live. And though the first sweet sting of love be past, the sweet that almost venom is, though youth, with tender and extravagant delight, the first and secret kiss by twilight hedge, the insane farewell, repeated o'er and o'er, pass off, there shall succeed a faithful peace, beautiful friendship, tried by sun and wind, durable from the daily dust of life." The sun god frowned as her words fell from her lips. Even now, as she looked at him, he held out his arms. Surely she only played with this poor mortal youth. To him she must come, this rose who could own no lesser god than the sun god himself. But Marpessa spoke on: "And thou beautiful god, in that far time when in thy setting sweet thou gazest down on his grey head, wilt thou remember then that once I pleased thee, that I once was young?" So did her voice cease, and on the earth fell sudden darkness. For to Apollo had come the shame of love rejected, and there were those who said that to the earth that night there came no sunset, only the sullen darkness that told of the flight of an angry god. Yet later the silver moonbeams of Diana seemed to greet the dark earth with a smile, and in the winged car of Neptune, Idas and Marpessa sped on, greater than the gods, in a perfect harmony of human love that feared nor time, nor pain, nor death himself. End of Idas and Marpessa. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 12 of A Book of Myths. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. A Book of Myths by Jean Lang. Section 12. Arethusa. "We have victualled and watered," wrote Nelson from Syracuse in 1798, "and surely, watering at the fountain of Arethusa, we must have victory. We shall sail with the first breeze. And be assured I will return either crowned with laurel or covered with cypress." 3 days later he won the Battle of the Nile, one of the greatest sea fights of history. Here in our own land the tales of the Greek gods seem very remote. Like the colours in an old portrait, the humanity of the stories seems to have faded. But in Sicily they grow vivid at once. Almost, as we stand above Syracuse, that long yellow town by the sea, a blue-green sea, with deep purple shadows where the clouds above it grow dark, and little white-sailed boats, like white butterflies, wing their way across to the far horizon, can we have glimpse of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. Here, to this day, one of the myths most impossible of acceptance to the scientific modern mind lives on, and Arethusa is not yet forgotten. "In Ortygia," says Cicero, "is a fountain of sweet water, the name of which is Arethusa, of incredible flow, very full of fish, which would be entirely overwhelmed by the sea were its waters not protected from the waves by a rampart and a wall of stone." White marble walls have taken the place of the protecting barrier, but the spring bubbles up to this day, and Ortygia, Quail Island, is the name still given to that part of Syracuse. Fluffy-headed, long green stalks of papyrus grow in the fountain, and red and golden fish dart through its clear water. Beyond lie the low shores of Plymgrium, the fens of Lysimeleia, the hills above the Anapus, and above all towers Etna, in snowy and magnificent serenity and indifference to the changes wrought by the centuries to gods and to men. Yet here the present is completely overshadowed by the past, and even the story of Arethusa knocks loudly at the well-barricaded doors of 20th century incredulity. The beautiful Arethusa was a nymph in Diana's train, and many a time in the chase did she thread her way through the dim woodland, as a stream flows down through the forest from the mountains to the sea. But to her, at last, there came a day when she was no longer the huntress, but the hunted. The flaming wheels of the chariot of Apollo had made the whole land scintillate with heat, and the nymph sought the kind shelter of a wood where she might bathe in the exquisite coolness of the river that still was chilled by the snows of the mountain. On the branch of a tree that bent over the stream she hung her garments, and joyously stepped into the limpid water. A ray of the sun glanced through the leaves above her, and made the soft sand in the river's bed gleam like gold, and the beautiful limbs of the nymph seem as though carved from pure white marble by the hand of Pygmalion himself. There was no sound there but the gentle sound of the stream that murmured caressingly to her as it slowly moved on through the solitude, and so gently it flowed that almost it seemed to stand still, as though regretful to leave for the unknown forest so beautiful a thing as Arethusa. The earth seemed to love her, and heaven smiled above her. But suddenly the stillness of the stream was ruffled. Waves, like the newly born brothers of the billows of the sea, swept both downstream and upstream upon her, and the river no longer murmured gently, but spoke to her in a voice that thrilled with passionate longing. Alpheus, god of the river, had beheld her, and, beholding her, had loved her once and forever. An uncouth creature of the forest was he, unversed in all the arts of love-making. So not as a supplicant did he come to her, but as one who demanded fiercely love for love. Terror came upon Arethusa as she listened, and hastily she sprang from the water that had brought fear upon her, and hastened to find shelter in the woodlands. Then the murmur, as of the murmur of a river before a mighty flood comes to seize it and hold it for its own, took form in a voice that pled with her in tones that made her tremble as she heard. "Hear me, Arethusa," it said. "I am Alpheus, god of the river that now thou hast made sacred. I am the god of the rushing streams, the god of the thundering cataracts. Where the mountain streams crash over the rocks and echo through the shadowy hollows of the hills, I hold my kingship. Down from Etna I come, and the fire of Etna is in my veins. I love thee. I love but thee, and thou shalt be mine, and I thine forever." Then Arethusa, in blind panic, fled before the god who loved her. Through the shadowy forest she sped, while he swiftly gained upon her. The asphodel bent under her flying feet, and the golden flowers of the Fiore Maggio were swept aside as she fled. Yet ever Alpheus gained upon her, until at length she felt that the chase was ended, and cried to Diana to save her. Then a cloud, grey and thick and blinding as the mist that wraps the mountain tops, suddenly descended and enfolded her, and Alpheus groped for her in vain. "Arethusa!" she heard him cry, in a voice of piteous longing. "Arethusa, my beloved!" Patiently he waited, with the love that makes uncouth things beautiful, until at length a little breath from Zephyrus blew aside the soft grey veil that hid his beloved from his sight, and he saw that the nymph had been transformed into a fountain. Not for a moment did Alpheus delay, but, turning himself into a torrent and flood, he rushed on in pursuit of Arethusa. Then did Diana, to save her votary, cleave a way for her through the dark earth, even into the gloomy realm of Pluto himself, and the nymph rushed onward, onward still, and then upward, until at length she emerged again to the freedom of the blue sky and green trees, and beheld the golden orange groves and the grey olives, the burning red geranium flowers, and the great snow-capped mountain of Sicily. But Alpheus had a love for her that cast out all fear. Through the terrible blackness of the Cocytus valley he followed Arethusa, and found a means of bursting through the encumbering earth and joining her again. And in a spring that rises out of the sea near the shore, he was able at last to mingle his waters with those of the one for whom he had lost his godship. And now from their fountains in Ina's mountains, down one vale where the morning basks, like friends once parted, grown single-hearted, they ply their watery tasks. At sunrise they leap from their cradles steep in the cave of the shelving hill. At noontide they flow through the woods below and the meadows of asphodel, and at night they sleep in the rocking deep beneath the Ortygian shore, like spirits that lie in the azure sky when they love but live no more. Shelley. End of Arethusa. Recording by James K. White. Chula Vista.